It was an indescribable scene. There were women scattered over the floor on scraps of straw, some of them quite obviously with a mark of death on their faces.
Berlin, 1943. The winter air was sharp and biting, wrapping the city in a shroud of cold and fear. Night after night, the streets fell silent as shadows stretched long, hiding secrets and fears. Windows were shuttered, doors bolted. No one dared to speak for fear that even the walls might betray them. But in the heart of this darkness, there was a woman who refused to let fear silence her. Gerda Valentiner, a schoolteacher in Denmark, was no stranger to bravery. In a time when many chose silence, she chose action. Her hands, accustomed to holding books and guiding young minds, became instruments of resistance. For her, the children she taught were not just students. They were souls that needed protection. And when the Nazi regime swept through Denmark and orders came to round up the Jewish community, she knew she could not stand by and watch. The faces of her students, young, innocent, filled with the dreams of childhood, haunted her. It was unthinkable that they would be taken away, ripped from the only life they knew, and thrust into a world of terror. One cold September evening, Gerda's resolve was tested. She stood at the threshold of a small, dimly lit apartment, her heart pounding as she knocked softly. When the door opened, she was met by the fearful eyes of Ester and Reuben Scheftelowitz. They were just one of the many Jewish families in Copenhagen, trying desperately to find a way to escape. Gerda spoke quietly, her voice steady, but her eyes betraying the urgency of the moment. "They are coming," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder as if the Gestapo might appear at any moment. "We don't have much time. You must let me take the children tonight." Esther's eyes widened, filling with tears as she clutched her young son and daughter to her chest. "Take them?" she breathed, her voice trembling. "But where?" "To my home," Gerda replied, her gaze never leaving Esther's face. "I will keep them safe until I can get them to Sweden. You must trust me." Silence fell between them, thick with fear and the weight of impossible decisions. But finally, with a shaky nod, Esther released her children. "Go with her," she murmured, kissing their foreheads with a fierce, desperate tenderness. "Go, and be brave." Gerda wrapped them in heavy coats and scarves, covering their frightened faces. "Stay close," she whispered, gripping their small hands tightly as they slipped out into the night. The journey to her home was a blur of quick steps, breath held in terror every time a shadow moved. When they finally crossed the threshold of her small house, Gerda breathed a sigh of relief. "You'll be safe here," she promised, kneeling to look into their wide, tear-filled eyes. "But we must be very quiet." Over the next few days, more children came. One by one, she gathered them, some plucked from hiding places, others taken from parents who knew this might be the last time they ever saw their children. She hid them in the small, cramped attic of her home, whispering words of comfort as they clung to her. She sang them lullabies in hushed tones, her voice trembling as she tried to soothe their fears. But food was scarce, and the children, already frightened and confused, began to grow weak. Gerda watched helplessly as they nibbled on scraps of bread, refusing anything that might violate their Jewish dietary laws. She saw their fragile forms growing thinner, their eyes losing the light of hope. "Enough," she murmured to herself one day, rising abruptly. She took what little money she had and ventured out, her heart pounding with fear and determination. When she returned, she carried a small set of new dishes and carefully selected food that she knew they would eat. It was a small gesture, but for those children, huddled in her attic, it was everything. They ate slowly, tears mingling with smiles as she watched with a fierce pride swelling in her chest. "You are not alone," she told them softly, her voice thick with emotion. "You are never alone. I will do everything I can to keep you safe." The weeks passed in a blur of tension and fear. Each night, Gerda would sit by the small attic door, listening to the distant sounds of sirens and shouting, praying that they would pass by her home. Twice there were close calls, Gestapo officers knocking on doors, searching for hidden Jews. Each time, Gerda's heart felt as if it might shatter, but somehow they remained undiscovered, until one night in October, when the inevitable happened. The knock on her door was sharp and insistent, reverberating through the house like a death knell. Gerda's breath caught in her throat. She glanced at the children, huddled silently in the attic, their eyes wide with terror. "Stay quiet," she mouthed, rising slowly to open the door. Two uniformed officers stood there, their faces stern and suspicious. "Frau Valentiner," one of them said, his gaze sweeping over her small, trembling frame. "We have received reports that you are harboring Jewish children." Gerda's heart pounded so loudly, she feared they might hear it. She forced a smile, stepping aside. "You are welcome to search," she replied, her voice steady. "There is no one here but me." The officers pushed past her, their boots echoing ominously as they searched each room. Every second felt like an eternity. Gerda stood frozen, her hands clenched at her sides, praying that the children would stay silent, that the attic door would remain hidden. When the door finally closed behind them, Gerda leaned against the wall, her entire body shaking with relief. She climbed the stairs to the attic, her heart heavy with gratitude and fear. The children looked up at her with wide eyes, their faces pale. "It's all right," she murmured, gathering them into her arms. "It's all right. We're safe for now." But she knew their safety was fragile, hanging by a thread that could snap at any moment. She had to get them out. Sweden was their only hope, a place where the Nazi reach could not extend, where they could be truly free. "I'll find a way," she promised them, her voice filled with quiet determination. "I will get you to Sweden." The following morning, Gerda knew time was running out. The Gestapo's visit had shaken her deeply, but it also spurred her to act. She couldn't risk another close call. The children needed to be moved, now. She reached out to the Danish resistance, a small network of brave souls willing to risk everything to save their Jewish neighbors. Together, they devised a plan. The children would be smuggled to the coast, hidden in the cramped hold of a fishing boat, and from there, they would cross the icy waters to Sweden. It was a perilous journey, fraught with dangers. The sea was patrolled by German naval forces, and every boat was searched meticulously. One slip, one careless word, and it would mean the end. But there was no other way. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Gerda gathered the children one last time. Their small faces peered up at her, a mixture of hope and fear in their eyes. She knelt down, looking each one in the eye, trying to imprint their faces into her memory. Would this be the last time she saw them? "You must be brave," she whispered softly, her voice trembling despite her efforts to stay strong. "Tonight, we will leave. But you must stay quiet, no matter what. Remember, there is hope waiting for you on the other side." She led them out under the cover of darkness, the cold night air biting at their skin. The streets were eerily quiet, the tension palpable. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every sound made her heart lurch. The children clung to her, their small hands cold and trembling in hers. She wished she could shield them from the terror of it all, wished she could bear their fear for them. But all she could do was keep moving forward. They made their way to the edge of the city, where a battered old truck awaited them. The driver, an old fisherman with grizzled hair and kind eyes, nodded silently as Gerda lifted the children into the back. He had been doing this for months, ferrying desperate families to the coast, but each journey carried the same weight of fear. As they rumbled through the deserted streets, Gerda's thoughts swirled. What if they were stopped? What if this was a trap? But there was no turning back, not now. She glanced back at the children, their faces pale and silent in the dim light. "We're almost there," she murmured, as much to reassure herself as them. The truck rolled to a stop near a secluded cove. The driver climbed out, gesturing for Gerda to follow. She helped the children out, one by one, their feet crunching softly on the gravelly ground. Ahead, the sea stretched out like a vast, dark void. A small boat bobbed gently at the shore, its silhouette barely visible against the inky water. "This is it," the driver whispered, his voice low and urgent. "You'll be safe in Sweden." Gerda's heart tightened as she guided the children toward the boat. She had to force herself to let go of their hands, to watch as they were bundled into the small, fragile vessel. It seemed impossible that such a tiny boat could carry such precious cargo across the dangerous waters. "Will you come with us?" one of the children asked, his voice small and hopeful. Gerda's throat tightened. She shook her head slowly. "No, little one," she whispered. "I have to stay. There are others who need me." Tears brimmed in the child's eyes, but he nodded bravely. "Will we see you again?" She wanted to say yes. She wanted to promise them that they would all be reunited, that they would see a day when they could laugh together again, free from fear. But she couldn't. Instead, she leaned down and kissed each child on the forehead, her heart breaking with every whispered goodbye. "Remember," she said softly, "you are not alone. Be brave. Be strong. And when you reach the other side, live. Live the life that was taken from so many." With a final glance, she stepped back, watching as the fishermen guided the boat into the churning waters. She stood on the shore, the cold wind biting at her skin, her eyes fixed on the small vessel until it disappeared into the darkness. Only then did she allow the tears to fall, silent and bitter. The hours dragged by like lifetimes. She stood there alone, her heart aching with fear and hope. Had they made it? Were they safe? She would not know until morning. All she could do was wait, the waves crashing around her in a relentless rhythm, a reminder of the uncertainty that lay ahead. Dawn broke slowly, casting a pale light over the sea. Gerda's eyes burned from exhaustion, but she kept them fixed on the horizon. And then, as the first rays of sunlight touched the water, she saw it, a small speck moving steadily toward the opposite shore. Relief surged through her like a tidal wave. "They made it," she whispered, sinking to her knees in the cold sand. Thank God they made it. But even as the joy filled her, a deep sadness lingered. This was just one small victory in a war that was claiming thousands of lives every day. How many more children would be lost? How many families would be torn apart before this nightmare ended? With a heavy heart, she rose to her feet, wiping away the tears. There was no time to grieve. There were others who still needed her, others she could help. Turning away from the sea, she began the long walk back to the city, her shoulders straight, her resolve unbroken. She had saved these children, and as long as she drew breath, she would keep fighting for as many as she could. Gerda returned to her home in Copenhagen, the weight of her recent success mingling with the ever-present fear. The children were safe in Sweden, but there were others still at risk, families scattered in hiding places, hoping for a miracle. Each day that passed, the danger grew. The Gestapo was intensifying its efforts, and whispers of betrayal floated through the underground. Some Danes, fearful or greedy, began to turn on their neighbors, informing on those who dared to defy the Nazis. For people like Gerda, the risk of capture was now a shadow that loomed larger than ever. But Gerda could not stop. Every child she saved was a life rescued from the abyss, a future reclaimed from the hands of death. She knew the costs of resistance. She had seen it in the eyes of her friends, captured and tortured for their defiance. She had heard the screams echoing through the empty streets at night, but still, she pressed on. One evening, as she prepared to meet with a resistance contact, there was a sudden knock at her door. Gerda froze. It was late, too late for a casual visitor. Her heart leaped into her throat as she crept to the window, peering out into the darkness. A figure stood in the shadows, their face obscured by a heavy coat and hat. "Who's there?" she called softly, her voice trembling. "It's me," a familiar voice whispered. The figure stepped forward, the dim light from the street lamp revealing the face of Moritz Scheftelowitz. He was a young man now, his features hardened by years of fear and hiding, but the spark of hope in his eyes was unmistakable. He had been just a boy when she first took him in, one of the few children she had managed to reunite with after the war's end. "Moritz!" Gerda gasped, rushing forward to embrace him. But as her arms wrapped around him, she felt the tense trembling in his shoulders. "Gerda," he murmured, pulling back slightly, his eyes dark with worry. "They know about you. Someone told them, one of the families you tried to help." The word struck like a physical blow. Gerda's breath caught, her mind spinning. Had it all been for nothing? Would she now be the one hunted down, imprisoned, her name erased? "We have to get you out of here," Moritz insisted, his grip on her arms tightening. "There's a place outside the city, a farm. They can hide you until we figure out what to do." But Gerda shook her head slowly. "No," she whispered, the single word filled with determination. "I can't leave. There are still families I need to help. Children. I can't just abandon them." Moritz's expression tightened, pain flashing across his face. "If you stay, they'll arrest you. Do you understand? You can't help anyone if you're dead." The truth of his words hung between them, heavy and bitter. But Gerda's resolve remained unshaken. "If I leave, they'll go after the others. The people I've protected, the families I've hidden. They'll pay the price." "Then what?" he demanded, his voice breaking. "You just wait here and let them take you?" She reached up, gently cupping his face in her hands. "No, my dear boy. I wait here, and I continue to fight." The days that followed were a blur of tense anticipation. Gerda moved through her daily routine with a calmness that belied the turmoil within. She continued teaching, caring for the children, and passing messages to the resistance. But every knock on the door, every strange face on the street, sent a jolt of fear through her. She knew it was only a matter of time before the Gestapo came for her. And then, one cold evening in December, they did. It was just after sunset when they arrived, 3 black cars pulling up silently in front of her home. Gerda was in the kitchen, preparing a simple meal, when she heard the heavy, deliberate footsteps on her porch. She glanced out the window, her stomach twisting in fear as she saw the dark, uniformed figures approaching. There was no time to run, no place to hide. She stood there frozen as the door burst open, splintering under the force of the soldiers' boots. "Gerda Valentiner," the lead officer barked, his voice sharp and cold. "You are under arrest for aiding and abetting Jews and engaging in anti-state activities." Gerda took a deep breath, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I only did what was right," she said quietly. "I helped children, I protected families. If that is a crime, then yes, I am guilty." The officer's lips curled into a sneer. "Your defiance will not save you," he spat, "nor will it save the others. We will find them all, and they will suffer for your actions." His words sent a chill down her spine, but she refused to show fear. Instead, she squared her shoulders, her gaze steady. "Do what you must," she whispered. "But know this, no matter what you do to me, you will never break the spirit of those who believe in what is right." The soldiers grabbed her roughly, dragging her out into the cold night. As she was shoved into the back of one of the waiting cars, Gerda looked back at her home, the place that had been a refuge for so many, and felt a wave of sorrow wash over her. Would she ever see it again? Would she ever walk those familiar halls, hear the laughter of children echo through its rooms? The car lurched forward, and Gerda closed her eyes, bracing herself for what lay ahead. Torture, imprisonment, death, perhaps. But even as fear gripped her heart, she clung to one thought, one small, stubborn hope. The children she had saved were still out there. They were alive. And as long as they lived, her resistance, her fight, was not in vain. As the car disappeared into the night, the streets of Copenhagen fell silent once more. But somewhere in the darkness, a small fishing boat slipped across the water, carrying another group of children toward freedom. The cell was small and cold, its stone walls pressing in like a tomb. The air was heavy, suffocating in its stillness. Gerda sat on the narrow cot, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the blank concrete before her. The only light came from a small, barred window high above, casting thin shadows that shifted as the hours crawled by. Days bled into nights, indistinguishable in the unbroken monotony of captivity. But even here, even in the deepest despair, Gerda clung fiercely to one thing: hope. The interrogations began almost immediately. They dragged her from the cell, binding her hands as they marched her down a long, echoing corridor. Each step felt like walking toward the gallows. The Gestapo officers waited in a small bare room, their eyes hard and unyielding. They threw questions at her, their voices harsh and relentless. "Who helped you? Where are the other children? Tell us, or they will suffer for your silence." But Gerda's lips remained sealed. She would not betray those who had trusted her, who had risked everything to stand against this monstrous regime. She endured their threats, their shouts, even the sharp, stinging pain when they struck her. She would endure it all, because the price of breaking was too high. "You think you're strong," one of them sneered, his face inches from hers, his breath hot and foul. "But everyone breaks eventually. We'll see how long you last." Yet Gerda did not break. Day after day they came, trying to wear her down, trying to shatter her resolve. But each time she met their eyes with quiet defiance, her back straight, her voice steady. "I have nothing to say," she whispered again and again, the same unwavering answer. But inside, doubt began to creep in. How long could she keep this up? How long before they found the others on their own? The thought of the children, those precious, innocent lives, haunted her, their faces flashing before her eyes each time she closed them. Was she truly protecting them, or was she only delaying the inevitable? One night, as she lay curled on the cot, her body aching and bruised, the door to her cell creaked open. She tensed, blinking against the sudden brightness as a figure stepped inside. For a moment fear flared, but then she recognized him, an older man with a graying beard and weary eyes. He was no officer. He was one of the prisoners. "Who are you?" she breathed, pushing herself upright. The man glanced over his shoulder, checking the corridor before shutting the door quietly. "My name is Henrik," he murmured. I was told to give you a message." Gerda's heart leapt. A message? From whom? But she kept her expression neutral, waiting. "They're safe," Henrik whispered, his voice barely audible. "The children, they made it to Sweden. All of them." Relief washed over her in a dizzying wave. Safe. The word echoed through her mind, a lifeline in the darkness. She bit her lip, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for telling me." Henrik nodded slowly. "You did a good thing," he said softly, "but you know what they'll do to you, don't you?" Yes, she knew. They would break her, slowly and painfully. And when she could no longer hold out, they would make an example of her, a warning to anyone else who dared to resist. But the children were safe. The knowledge strengthened her, filling her with a fierce, unshakable resolve. "Let them do what they will," she murmured, raising her chin defiantly. "I am not afraid." The days dragged on, and the interrogations became more brutal. They deprived her of sleep, food, and warmth. They tried to strip away her dignity, her will, her very humanity. But each time she felt herself slipping, she thought of those children, of their faces bright with hope as they sailed away into the night. And she held on. One morning, they brought her into the interrogation room again, her legs barely able to support her. She swayed as they pushed her into a chair, her vision swimming. "This is your last chance," the officer growled, leaning close. "Tell us who helped you. Give us names." Gerda forced herself to focus, meeting his gaze steadily. She felt hollow, empty, as if every ounce of strength had been drained from her. But her spirit remained unbroken. "I have no names," she whispered, her voice hoarse but firm. The officer's expression darkened. He straightened, his face twisting in fury. "Then you will die," he hissed. The words hung in the air, heavy and final, but Gerda felt no fear. Instead, she closed her eyes, a small, sad smile tugging at her cracked lips. "Better to die with honor," she murmured softly, "than to live in shame." Silence fell. She waited, each heartbeat echoing in the stillness. Then slowly the officer turned and left the room, slamming the door behind him. They did not kill her. Not then. Instead, they left her in the cell, alone and forgotten, like a ghost lingering in the shadows. The days stretched into weeks, each one bleeding into the next. But still, Gerda held on. She had made a choice long ago, a promise to herself and to the children she had saved. No matter what they did to her, no matter how much they tried to break her, she would never betray them. And in the end, that unyielding spirit, her refusal to give in, was what saved her. As the war neared its end, the Gestapo's grip on Denmark weakened. The prisons, once full of those who defied the regime, became chaotic and disorganized. And then, one cold, bleak morning, the door to Gerda's cell swung open. She blinked in the harsh light, her heart pounding as a uniformed figure stepped inside. For a moment, terror flared. Was this it? Had they come to finish her off at last? But the man's face was not twisted in anger. Instead, he looked almost apologetic. "You're free," he said gruffly, tossing her a bundle of clothes. "The war's over, go free." The word seemed foreign, impossible. Gerda stood slowly, her limbs stiff and aching. She stumbled toward the door, blinking in the blinding sunlight. The sky was bright and clear, the air crisp with the promise of spring. And all around her, people were weeping, laughing, embracing each other in disbelief. She was free. But as she stepped out into the world again, Gerda knew that freedom was not the end. There was so much more to do, so many lives still broken, so many families shattered by the horrors of war. She thought of the children, scattered and alone, waiting for someone to find them, to tell them that it was safe to hope again. She would find them. She would make sure they knew they were not forgotten.